All right, so this is about where we left off last time. And we were talking about how when we look over the world, we are finding fossils of land animals everywhere. And folks, the fact that we're finding land animals fossilized all over the world points to a massive global, worldwide watery catastrophe that laid them down, as opposed to innumerable individual floods that laid them down individually. This is why we see these fossilized remains everywhere, including places like Antarctica and Alaska and Greenland, places where you would not expect to find them. And again, this just represents where we find dinosaur fossils. If I put up where we find all land animals, everything would be covered on this map. They're literally everywhere. And that's indicative of a worldwide flood. Go ahead and write this down, please. Anybody in here a fan of the show Forensic Files? No? Just me? Okay. So it's a show where they show how you can use science to solve crimes and stuff, and forensic science. It's a really neat show. I enjoyed watching a ton of those episodes, especially in our COVID years. So if you know anything about, if you've ever seen that show, you know that decay is something that occurs pretty much immediately after something dies. And it's not just your skin and your muscles and your organic material that decay, your bones eventually decay in and of themselves. So even if you have something die and you can keep all the scavengers away, it's just a matter of time before weathering and microbial decay will get rid of those bones altogether completely. Even in the ocean. I remember seeing an episode of Planet Earth a long time ago, where this big whale carcass drifted to the bottom of the ocean, and after a certain period of time, even the bones are gone. So in order to have a fossil, you have to have that animal covered completely, very quickly by water and sediment, and that's indicative of a flood. You can't just get that by an accidental transportation of these carcasses into the open sea. Decay will occur, they will not end up being fossilized. So the Cambrian explosion is something that we talked about just briefly. This is the period of time where all of the major phyla of animals just kind of explodes onto the scene out of nowhere with no precursors in the fossil record. So you have this blue-green algae that appears and exists in the rocks that are supposedly 3.5 billion years old. And then after that period of time, it's like, bang, now everything is there. So these complexities appear suddenly. Of course, that's the opposite of slow evolutionary progress that we would expect to see if naturalism and Darwin's idea was actually true. So when we talk about these things, well, we got to talk about transitional fossils, because Darwin's Tree of Life says that as one animal eventually develops, it will one day branch off, and that branch will turn into a whole new animal. And that's the idea behind it. So what I want to do right now is just take you through a few examples of the more famous transitional fossils out there. If you Google transitional fossils, you'll see about 100 or so examples. But again, I want to stress this. If the theory of evolution is true, everything in the fossil record should be a transitional fossil. We should see these animals slowly changing and slowly morphing into either different versions of themselves or a brand new animal altogether. And so when we're looking at these transitional fossils and we see the examples that the world gives us, this is not what we should find. You should find more than 100 transitional fossils. Everything should be a transitional fossil. But even so, let's look at some of the more famous ones. So this is Archaeopteryx, the supposed transition between dinosaur and bird. That's a very popular idea today, that dinosaurs eventually evolved into birds that we see today. And this is the missing link between those two. So when we examine it a little bit closer, what we find is that this animal has characteristics of birds and dinosaurs, but no actual transitional features. We share features with apes. That doesn't mean that we automatically have transitioned from them. You can't just share characteristics with animals. You have to find something that's in transition. You got to find an arm in transition to being a wing or something like that. And these are the things that we never ever find in the fossil record. Furthermore, we don't find any links between it and birds or dinosaurs. It stands alone. So it's not like you can go from this creature and go, towards the dinosaurs or towards birds. We don't see any transitions between those on either end. And true birds have been found that are dated to be older than Archaeopteryx. So, in other words, Archaeopteryx was not a transition, it was just a bird. If you look at all of the characteristics that this animal had, and you have a column of dinosaur characteristics and bird characteristics, it's pretty much all bird characteristics. It does have one or two reptilian features, but it was a bird, if we're being honest with ourselves. Another one is Tiktaalik. So this was the supposed transition where you went from a fish to a tetrapod, something that had legs and could actually walk on land. And when we look at this one, this probably looks a little bit familiar. It has characteristics of both fish and tetrapods, but no transitional features. And again, this is something that's shared with every transitional animal that you'll find on Google. That they might have characteristics of two things, but no actual transitions. We don't see any fins on their way to being arms, or vice versa. No fossils link it to fish or tetrapods. It stands alone. It's its own fully formed creature. And two true tetrapods have been found that have dated to be older than Tiktaalik. And again, we're going to get into these dates more when we talk about radiometric dating. Another popular example was Puhila. This was supposedly the transition from land animal to pinniped. Pretty quick story here. It turns out it was just a river otter. This one I do want to spend a little bit of time with, though, So this was the animal that supposedly linked hippopotami, or how do you say what's the plural of hippopotamus? Is it hippopotami? I don't even know. So this is the animal that went between a hippopotamus-type creature and a whale. So, the story goes that fish evolved into things that went onto the land, and, from there, it actually has another story where these tetrapods, these four-legged creatures, eventually went back into the water, and that's where we get whales from. So this creature, Rodhocetus, if I'm even pronouncing that right, this is an artistic rendition of this animal, and it was supposedly the transition between those two things. Now, if this was a transitional animal, which parts of its body would be important to find in the fossil record? So it's transitioning from a hippo to a whale. Which parts of it would we really want to find in the fossil record to confirm this transition? Feet, absolutely. You need to find its feet. Anything else? The tail, absolutely. So we would need to find evidence of its feet transforming into pectoral fins, and we would need to find evidence of its tail turning into a caudal fin. Well, guess where we don't find fossils? Exactly those locations. So when we're looking again at these supposed transitions, we're finding here lots and lots and lots of imagination and very, very, very few bones. Go ahead and write down these bottom 2 bullet points, please, along with the title. So transitional fossils is all you really need here, and then these 2 bullet points. So it was this fact that caused this individual, Colin Patterson, senior paleontologist from the British Museum of Natural History, to say this. And he's saying this in response to somebody who, so I suppose I should back up a bit. Colin Patterson was an author along with a paleontologist, and he wrote this book about evolution. And in that book about evolution, where he's talking about, how it occurred, he did not include any pictures. And so this is him responding to somebody who is criticizing his book because it did not have any illustrations of these transitions. He says, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Yet Gould and the American Museum people are hard to contradict." Stephen Jay Gould was the same position at the American Museum of Natural History. When they say there are no transitional fossils. I will lay it on the line, there is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. And so because of this, because of the fact that we don't find these transitional fossils in the fossil record, just like Darwin couldn't find any back in his day, we can't find them today, even though we've got trillions upon trillions of fossils to look at here. These fossils should show exactly what Darwin's theory says, if that theory was indeed valid. But they don't. And so what the scientific community is increasingly going to is this idea known as punctuated equilibrium. And so the idea here is that you make these big evolutionary jumps in very little time. In other words, evolution is still true, they'll say, but it's just happening so fast that we just never see it in the fossil record. You have these periods of time where everything is exactly the same, and then everything just happens all at once. And that's why there is no evidence of it. In other words, the lack of evidence is the evidence. This is the crazy stuff you have to go to when you ignore the history that's plainly written in the Bible. If you have your foundation in this idea of naturalism, and you believe that the grand story of evolution is how everything got here, this is the stuff you have to believe. This is going to be fun. I like this section. Go ahead and write the title, please. Anybody know what a living fossil is? It's not a fossil that's alive.
Like an animal that's like...
Yeah, you're right on the money there. Go ahead and write down that definition. So these are fossils of animals that existed supposedly millions or billions of years ago, and they are identical to animals alive today. And we'll run through a good number of examples of these. So, can anybody tell me why it is that we should no longer see animals today that are exactly the same as they were way back in the day, supposedly? Time of dinosaurs, before the dinosaurs. Why does that really make no sense? In terms of a naturalistic worldview. Yeah, you'd think that they should be changing slowly over time. But of course, what the scientific community will say is they'll say, well, these creatures are just so well adapted to their environment that they don't need to evolve. They don't need to change. In fact, they call it evolutionary stasis. So this is something when animals don't seem to evolve at all over these very long periods of time. So they'll say that they're so well adapted, they just don't need to change. However, this is not possible. You guys have heard of these massive extinction events, I'm sure, at some point in your educational career. So there was supposedly this Permian extinction event that occurred 250 million years ago, eliminated 95% of the species on the Earth. And then there was supposedly the big meteor strike that killed off the dinosaurs, along with 75% of what was left of the population. So the thing is, these massive extinction events, if they happened, would have dramatically changed the environment of the entire world. There's no way that animals can still be the same today when the climate and the weather and the environment around them is changing so dramatically. They would have to change along with it. But that's not what we find. We are finding animals that are virtually identical today as they supposedly were sometimes hundreds of millions of years ago. So let's take a look at some of those. Go ahead and write down, this is still under the living fossils section, just write down stromatolites. You've heard of algae before, and algae is really the oldest thing that we find in the fossil record in terms of a naturalistic aging scheme. And they are supposedly 3.5 billion years old. They have very, very short, very, very short periods of time between generations. So if anything should be changing a lot over that long period of time, it should be stromatolites, but they are not changing. Over 3.5 billion years of time for them to change or evolve and adapt, or at least be a little bit different, they're not. They are the exact same today as they supposedly were 3.5 billion years ago. You've heard of this one already from our book. Go ahead and write down coelacanth. Fossils of, go ahead. Fossils of this creature were found between 440 million years ago and 65 million years ago. So everybody just assumed that it went extinct along with the dinosaurs. And based on what we were able to find with these fossils, paleontologists and the secular scientific community believed that the muscular fins in this fish were on their way to evolving into legs. So they believed this was one of those transitional animals. Well, big surprise, we found it today. And this was found not only not extinct, but not even endangered. So these coelacanths are swimming around, I think mostly off the coast of Malaysia, and they've been found in other places too. But of course, their fins are not evolving into legs. People thought that they used their fins to maybe walk across the ocean floor, but no, they're just fish, and they haven't changed at all from 440 million years ago. The horseshoe crab. Write down horseshoe crab. Once again, fossils from these creatures, they're relatively famous. It's probably the state fossil of some state. I'll have to Google that to find out. But the horseshoe crab, supposedly almost 500 million years old, and no change whatsoever over that period of time. The horseshoe crabs we see kind of waddling over our sandy terrain today look the exact same as the ones that supposedly existed 440 million years ago. And it's not just animals, it's also trees. Go ahead and write down Wollemi pine. So trees can go extinct, just like animals, and from the fossil record, everybody thought that this tree was pretty prevalent from 200 to 40 million years ago, but it went extinct 2 million years ago. And then they find one growing in Australia. And so scientists said it was basically like finding a dinosaur in your backyard. And so again, when we're looking at these fossils, whether they're animals, whether they're trees, or anything in between, oftentimes we find these things that supposedly went extinct millions and millions of years ago, and they show up right in our backyard. Now, again, I could spend all day and all week just going through all the different examples of living fossils that are out there. But I want to kind of cap this off with just a couple more. So what I'm going to do for the remaining ones, I'm just going to isolate the ones that are found in Wisconsin. So one of the more famous living fossils found in Wisconsin is a scorpion. Go ahead and write down scorpion. So once again, these fossils are 437 million years old, supposedly, and they are indistinguishable from the modern scorpions that we find in our world today. And actually, this one was so well preserved, they were able to actually see what was going on inside of it. And what we found is not only is the outside exoskeleton of this scorpion the same as it was, but the internal organs are still the exact same, completely indistinguishable from modern scorpions. And again, yesterday we talked about this timeline, right? So we talked about this timeline and about how it's so difficult for us to wrap our minds around how big of a period of time this is. Well, remind me, how long ago did dinosaurs go extinct supposedly? What was that number? Anybody remember? That's okay. 65 million years ago is when dinosaurs supposedly went extinct. And we're finding scorpions that are supposedly 437 million years old still walking around today looking the exact same. This is like 10 times crazier than walking into your backyard and finding a stegosaurus there, because it's that much further in the past. And one more here that's found in Wisconsin. Write down jellyfish. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking. Where?
It's in the southern part of the state. I don't remember if it's southwest or southeast. I think it's kind of close to here, but I'd have to look. What this really speaks to is it speaks to how quickly these animals were fossilized. And we're going to talk about that more in the geologic record. But this fossilization process had to happen quickly. Otherwise, you're not going to get these jellyfish getting fossilized. It had to happen very quickly. That's exactly what we would expect from the biblical flood. But again, don't let this huge period of time just escape the significance that we really need to give it here. This is 500 million years old, and these jellyfish supposedly haven't changed in that period of time. And yet, in that same time scale, that same 500 million years, over that same period of time, a worm-like creature has evolved and branched off, and branched off, and branched off, and branched off, and eventually you get you and me. So in this same 500 million years, that jellyfish have not changed, a worm-like creature has changed into humans. That's what you have to believe in order to believe that the grand story of evolution is true. Go ahead and write this whole thing down. It's pretty much what I just mentioned. At least the top part is. So the thing here is, if you find evidence of a creature changing over time, that's evidence for evolution. But if you find evidence of these animals not changing over time, well, that's also evidence for evolution. That's where the problem comes in. Because a scientific theory has to be falsifiable. If it is not, at least it was nothing fragile. If it's not falsifiable, then you're going from the realm of science to the realm of philosophy.